The 4% rule was originally popularized by retired financial advisor William Bengen in the 1990s, and has been the standard bearer for retirement withdrawal strategies ever since. However, as we've covered in previous videos, it's not perfect, and by its very design, it tends to leave a lot of money on the table for the vast majority of retirees. That's understandable, given that it was designed to survive at least 30 years in retirement during the worst market environments we've seen over the past century, such as the Great Depression and the stagflationary 1970s. However, most market environments that retirees will experience will not be nearly as bad as the Great Depression or the stagflationary 1970s. If it were, those periods would be considered normal. So many people have created modifications to the 4% approach in an effort to minimize its weaknesses while enhancing its already notable strengths. One such individual is certified financial planner Michael Kitces. In an article on his website, he lays out what he calls a ratchet-style withdrawal approach that seeks to allow retirees to spend more of their upside if they, like most retirees have, experience a market environment that's a bit more friendly than those of the Great Depression. Today, we're going to be taking a look at this approach and comparing it to the 4% rule in order to determine if its modifications are worth the potential trade-offs. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the ratcheting withdrawal strategy. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to the investing platform M1 Finance. Get started investing for free today. Before we get into the analysis for this approach, I want to discuss how we'll be grading the strategies in this series. Basically, we'll be looking at 4 criteria for each approach. First, how much income they generate. More income is obviously better, but we'll also be giving a little extra credit to strategies that generate an additional income early on, since we're more likely to be healthy and energetic enough to take advantage of our income in our younger years than we are when we're 90-somethings. Second is risk and sustainability. This criteria basically measures how likely you are to outlive your money using a strategy, as well as how easy or difficult it might be to follow the rules laid out by the strategy in reality. Third is the predictability or stability of the income the strategy generates. Basically, this criteria looks at how often your income rises or falls on an inflation-adjusted basis from year to year while using a strategy, and how big those changes are. And fourth is how well the approach manages to maintain or raise your buying power over time. Which criteria will ultimately be the most important to you will depend on your goals, financial situation, and preference. And because the performance of withdrawal strategies are often heavily influenced by the mix of investments that you happen to have, we'll also be looking at each withdrawal approach under a conservative, moderate, and aggressive asset allocation as shown by this chart. With that being said, let's get into today's strategy. So, real quick, for those who don't know, here's how the strategy works. It starts off just like Bengen's original 4% rule. In the first year of retirement, you will withdraw a certain percentage of your nest egg to live on. This is known as your initial safe withdrawal rate, and since this approach is a modification of Bengen's 4% rule, I'm going to use 4% as the withdrawal rate today. Where the ratcheting strategy diverges from the original 4% rule is that you also choose 3 other figures to use when calculating withdrawals after that first year. Those 3 figures are what I'll refer to as the ratcheting threshold, the ratcheting amount, and the ratcheting cooldown. The ratcheting threshold is simply the percentage that the current value of your portfolio will have to climb, relative to where it began, before making any adjustments to your yearly withdrawals. The ratcheting amount is simply the amount that you'll increase your ongoing withdrawals by in the years where you're able to increase your income according to this strategy. And the ratcheting cooldown is the minimum number of years you want to wait in between increases in your withdrawals. The reason this is here is because if you happen to hit a really great bull market at the start of your retirement, say like much of the 1990s or 2010s were, you may find yourself increasing your withdrawals almost every single year. And if you should run into a rough bear market down the road, like we did for much of the 2000s, that highly elevated withdrawal amount that you built up during the 90s could end up quickly draining your savings. This is doubly important for the ratcheting strategy because it does not actually have a way for you to decrease your withdrawals over time. Though obviously in reality you could do that if you wanted to. It just wouldn't be part of the rule's intended design. The ratcheting strategy was built to provide you an ever-increasing income floor that would be safe to follow based on historical precedent. Again, it's a modification of the 4% rule. So, in summary, you start by choosing your safe withdrawal rate, and then every year thereafter, you check the inflation-adjusted value of your portfolio. If that value is above your ratcheting threshold, and you've waited long enough to increase your withdrawals based on your ratcheting cooldown, you will increase your withdrawal for that year by whatever your ratcheting amount is. If it hasn't risen by enough for you to increase your withdrawals, then you will default back to what you would do under Bengen's original 4% rule, which is to say withdraw an amount equal to your previous withdrawal after adjusting for inflation. Here's a chart to show you how this approach differs from the original 4% rule. I've assumed a ratcheting threshold of 50%, a cooldown of 3 years, and a ratcheting amount of 10%. I've also rounded the market value before withdrawal and the income figures down to the nearest $100 just so they look a bit cleaner. Now, this is only a 5-year hypothetical example, but you can already see how the ratcheting strategy can start to make a difference in the income that you will generate from your savings over time, and as a result, will often leave less money on the table by the time all is said and done, at least compared to the 4% rule. So that's how the ratcheting strategy calculates its withdrawals. But how well does it stack up in regards to our 4 criteria? As usual, we'll start by examining its historical income-generating capabilities. The first factor I look at when analyzing withdrawal strategies is the income that they generate. As you can see from the chart on your screen now, in terms of income generated on a $1 million nest egg, the ratcheting approach would generally outperform the $40,000 a year in income that the standard inflation-adjusted approach would generate. Granted, it did run out of money in a few of the scenarios using the conservative and aggressive allocations, but then so did the original 4% rule using this dataset. So in terms of overall income generation, the ratcheting style approach is always going to be at least as good as the 4% rule, and if things go reasonably well, it can be even better. The story in the early years suggests that the approaches are usually going to perform almost exactly the same, likely because most 5-year periods don't see enough inflation-adjusted and withdrawal-adjusted growth to rise above that ratcheting threshold that we set. That sort of thing usually takes a little more time. The second factor I look at when analyzing withdrawal strategies is risk and sustainability. Risk, or the likelihood that you'll outlive your savings, examines a couple of metrics. The first is what I call the approach's survival rating, or the percentage of possible retirement starting dates that would have avoided running out of money over a specific length of time. In this series, I'm using 30 years as the time frame to determine if an approach survived retirement. The second is what I call the approach's depletion time, or how long the approach survives in its worst-case scenario. This is important to consider, because while 2 approaches can have the same likelihood of making it at least 30 years, they can have wildly different worst-case scenarios. Sustainability considers how easy or difficult an approach is to maintain, given the experiences its strengths and weaknesses are likely to produce for the retiree. Starting with survival rating, we can see that the ratcheting approach doesn't give up any ground compared to the 4% rule, which is unsurprising given that it is identical to the 4% rule in situations where your portfolio doesn't actually rise far enough above its initial value to trigger withdrawal adjustments, which just so happens to be the case for these worst-case scenarios over the past century. So in terms of risk, both approaches are basically equal. In terms of sustainability, the ratcheting approach likely holds an edge, simply because it gives you the option to raise your income over time without any increases in risk, at least based on the almost 100 years of historical data we have available to us. Now granted, the size of your nest egg is likely going to be smaller. That's by design. But in terms of its lowest point, such as in the depths of a major market downturn, it's usually not that much smaller than it would be using the traditional 4% rule. So I think that for most people, the added income will more than make up for the slightly lower net worth when markets bottom out. The third factor I look at when analyzing withdrawal strategies is the predictability or stability of the income stream it produces. And in this regard, the advantage clearly goes to the ratcheting approach. There's just no getting around the fact that, by definition, the income is either going to match what we see in the inflation-adjusted approach or best it in each and every scenario. It's hard to get much more clear-cut than that. Both strategies would have experienced inflation-adjusted declines in income in a couple of scenarios using both the conservative and aggressive allocations, when they, outlived their savings. Though due to the rounding in the table, the aggressive allocation doesn't actually show that. But unlike the inflation-adjusted approach, the ratcheting strategy is capable of increasing your income on an inflation-adjusted basis, which appears to happen somewhere between once and twice a decade on average using the moderate and aggressive allocations. The fourth and final factor I look at when analyzing a withdrawal strategy is its long-term impact on your buying power. And just like with the predictability factor, the winner here is clearly the ratcheting approach. Again, it really is as simple as one approach is capable of seeing its buying power rise, and the other isn't. Since there's literally no downside to the ratcheting approach relative to the traditional 4% rule in this regard, as your buying power can't go down unless you outlive your savings, which, as we've seen, never happened to the ratcheting approach in a situation where it didn't also happen to the 4% rule, it is a pretty clear-cut decision. In his article, Michael Kitces argued that due to its dominance over the traditional 4% rule, we should really be using this ratcheting approach as the standard against which all other retirement withdrawal strategies are measured. And you know, he's got a point. Because what we've got here is a withdrawal approach that equals or betters the traditional 4% rule in every relevant metric aside from leaving you with a larger ending net worth. And while a larger net worth can be an important metric for some retirees, such as those that want to leave an inheritance to their heirs or are in a fortunate enough situation where they don't actually need all the money that the ratcheting approach may allow them to live on, for most people it's probably not the most important metric. So long as their ending net worth remains above zero, of course. Unfortunately, the ratcheting style approach is slightly more complicated to explain to someone quickly. It's not because it's realistically super complicated, it just requires you to keep track of a few more things than the 4% rule does, which makes it a little more difficult to wrap your head around at first if someone's explaining it to you in a place where you're not able to actually map out some of the example figures. This elevator pitch factor, or accessibility as it may be sometimes referred to, often matters a lot more than we give it credit for when it comes to spreading ideas to the masses. Generally speaking, assuming two competing ideas both work reasonably well, which in this case both do, the more accessible one is usually the one that ends up catching on with the majority, even if those who dig into the topic more thoroughly come to the realization that the less accessible idea is superior in most instances. And since the 4% rule also came out first, it had that advantage of added time to spread itself far and wide. But what do you think? Should the ratcheting approach replace the 4% rule as the measuring stick for all other retirement withdrawal strategies? Let me know in the comments section below. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.